In the last lecture, we saw how the radicals rose up to challenge the liberal establishment with a new kind of personal politics. In this lecture, we'll see how that played out in the civil rights movement. We'll begin by looking at the liberals' views of civil rights. Then we'll move to the three different responses by African Americans to the liberal system of civil rights. And we'll conclude with the effects of the civil rights movement and a permanent class divide among African Americans that exists today. To understand the liberals on race, we have to first begin with their view of a pluralistic nation. The liberal elites believed in a colorblind society. Every single university, major university, had a course on race relations. There's a wonderful autobiography by Louis Killian, a sociologist, who said, in the 1930s, if you would have suggested at the University of Chicago there was any difference between the races, he said it was laughable. If you looked at, say, the 1950 UNESCO report on, quote, the race concept, there the liberals all said that science had affirmatively disproven any differences between the races, even if geneticists themselves didn't agree. So the liberal view was that culture itself was irrelevant, that all human beings were the same, and that liberal expertise would guide us to a colorblind society and a balance between different races, ethnicities, and religions and classes. However, in their actual policies, the general liberal application was that we need to keep these different groups separated so they won't fight. There were many race riots. If you look at the post-World War I period and what was called the Great Migrations, about 6 million African Americans moved north to urban cities to take jobs in World War I and in World War II. In the Great Migrations, blacks moved into large urban cities that were filled with white ethnics in their own enclaves, Polish, Irish, Italian, German, who sought to preserve their own Catholic traditions, their own ways of life. And so the liberals had a policy of balancing these different groups. The Newark Housing Authority would use federal monies to create, quote, 2 Irish, 1 Negro, 2 Italian, and 2 Jewish projects. The policies we look at today is simply a matter of racial discrimination through banks and home loan applications. Redlining, blockbusting, steering. These were ways that liberals kept different classes and races apart so they can avoid some of the racial tensions that occurred in Chicago in 1919. We're very familiar today with the 1921 Tulsa riots. This is where whites burned down about 35 square blocks of Tulsa, including Black Wall Street. But the way that this is described, we're often not given the full history, which is the blacks had a thriving community in that city and got the best of 2 exchanges with whites before the full-on riot. So the liberals wanted to achieve a colorblind society, but would do so very gradually in a piecemeal fashion. They adopted a contradictory position of affirmative action. What that meant is that they wanted a kind of race preference to advance blacks towards equality on the one hand. On the other hand, they firmly opposed racial quotas. The Supreme Court opposed racial quotas, the NAACP opposed racial quotas, as did all of the leading liberals. The liberals introduced affirmative action policies during the New Deal and during World War II. The Public Works Administration, the TVA, the Housing Authority, and the Fair Employment Practices Commission were examples of these. When A. Philip Randolph threatened to march on Washington to argue for more black jobs to support the war effort, FDR issued an executive order creating the Fair Employment Practices Commission. This was a typical liberal move. It was a commission with an expertise on race relations that would not have a mandate to demand diversity within different corporations. Rather, its point was publicity. It could shame corporations into hiring more minorities with the threat of canceling a government military contract. When the FEPC was disbanded after World War II, states introduced their own FEPCs. New York introduced the State Commission Against Discrimination. 25 states followed suit. What these were commissions where one could report discrimination in hiring. The commission would then hold a hearing And if they thought that there was disparate treatment, not disparate impact, but an actual instance of racial discrimination, then they had a moral suasion. They could pressure the company into some kind of affirmative action policy, and if need be, could report to the Attorney General to take legal action. But the whole point was to avoid any kind of legal mandate for quotas or racial diversity. Brown v. Board of Education is another good example of this middle-of-the-road policy. Brown v. Board did not mandate colorblind policies. Rather, Brown suggested that the group was more important than individual injunctive relief, but it wanted to put a mandate on the progress of the racial group. And so through different court injunctions, different school districts could integrate at different levels or were ordered to do so. Blacks in the 1950s made vast economic and social gains, and so they saw incredible improvement. From 1940 to 1960, blacks living in poverty fell from 87% to 47%. They started off, again, very low in the socioeconomic ladder, but climbed up very quickly. They made gains in labor unions. Blacks moved to cities like Chicago, where they took jobs in industry. In Chicago, the black population rose 77% in the 1940s, 65% in the 1950s, from 278 to 813,000 residents. 20 to 30% of the workers in Detroit's automobile factories were African American, some 60% at the Dodge Assembly plant. Non-white median income rose faster than whites. It quadrupled from 1939 to 1951. Businesses appealed to an estimated $15 billion worth of the Negro market. After the 1957 recession, where black unemployment was twice that of whites, some liberals began to talk about benign or benevolent quotas, some kind of an affirmative action policy, but it was staunchly resisted. Rather, the argument was more affirming programs for African Americans. Liberals like Michael Harrington, who wrote The Other America in 1962, this was seen to be the book that launches the war on poverty, argued for the moral reform of blacks or the assimilation of blacks to mainstream liberal society. He argued for blacks attaining the moral virtues of white middle-class America: hard work, frugality, sexual restraint. He attacked the, quote, culture of poverty. He argued that liberals should reform housing, education, medical care, and restore the black family. In the early 60s, illegitimacy was something like 21%. In the 1964 Civil Rights Act, this was the pinnacle of the liberal policy of colorblindness. The act itself barred any kind of diversity hiring or racial preference as a form of reverse discrimination. 68% of whites approved of the 64 Civil Rights Act, which was seen by all whites in the North, Democrat and Republican, as a way of punishing the segregation in the South. And they would achieve this by doing away with segregation without paying a price of reverse racism. Now we look at the three different responses by African Americans to white liberal society. There are three different groups, as best as I can tell. The first we'll call the black bourgeois. African Americans were very different in different parts of the country. As blacks moved north to take jobs in industry, they were often dislocated. The black family began to fragment and fall apart. There were changes in the kinds of religions and rites that they practiced. And so there were regional differences between the North and the South, a place where Martin Luther King Jr. comes from. As blacks moved into the middle class, or the black bourgeois, they did what any lower class group does. They imitated the upper middle class. This meant that blacks used Congolese, a strong chemical agent, to relax their hair so they could comb their hair like whites. It meant that blacks stratified into different churches, upper middle class churches, lower middle class churches. The lower middle class blacks went to storefront churches where there were charismatic leaders who would engage in more Pentecostal ceremonies with more raucous music, as opposed to the more sedate forms that you would find in upper class black society. Black millionaires first come on the scene in the late 19th century, and so there had been class stratification that was often connected to skin color for about 50, 60 years. The largest denomination, religious denomination among African Americans was the National Baptist Convention. It had 6.4 million members. And blacks in 1966 favored integration. Of course, they supported Brown v. Board and the Civil Rights Act. But they also rejected Malcolm X. They rejected black nationalism and the kind of violence that they saw in the riots in Watts and other cities. Joseph H. Jackson, who represented the black bourgeois, was involved in a kind of struggle with Martin Luther King Jr. While he wasn't the leader, he was a member of the faction within the National Baptist Convention. Joseph H. Jackson, while he supported the Montgomery bus boycott, the boycott in Baton Rouge, he disagreed with MLK on the tactics that should be applied by the National Baptist Convention. He argued for civil obedience, not civil disobedience. He wanted legal change. The way to understand this is that Jackson was part of, one could argue, Mayor Richard Daley's Chicago machine. It was estimated that this Democratic machine had access to some 60,000 jobs. And the way that blacks had taken power in this machine was to compromise with the Democratic Party. And each of the different groups would receive different favors from the administration. Joseph H. Jackson lists these in his book, Unholy Shadows in Freedom's Holy Light. He was not alone. There were the Silent Six aldermen, these were black aldermen in Chicago, who agreed with the basic segregation policy in the city of Chicago to keep the different ethnicities and races isolated in their own enclaves. Joseph H. Jackson argued in favor of racial preference and against racial prejudice. Racial preference, he argued, was the natural affinity that different groups have for their own kind. Prejudice meant legal discrimination based on those racial differences. He argued that progressive blacks like Martin Luther King Jr. wanted to ally with white elites because they wanted to be around whites instead of helping to improve their own people and the economic situation of blacks in cities like Chicago. And so Joseph H. Jackson argued for the promotion of blacks economically and socially within the Democratic Party machine, as opposed to some kind of a broader interracial movement that Martin Luther King Jr. was crusading for. Martin Luther King Jr. would forward the idea of the beloved community. This was a covenant with God that all human beings were God's children. He rejected this distinction based upon race, that one would naturally prefer someone of his or her own skin color. And he prophesied a spiritual unity with whites. What's key here is he didn't just mean an individual transcendence of race in the form of friendship or interracial marriage. What he meant is that human beings would no longer distinguish one another on the basis of race. And this became a kind of religion. Martin Luther King Jr., in this sense, was a prophet. He praised the Declaration of Independence, but he faulted the country for failing to achieve this, quote, higher law, which then justified a civil disobedience. Desegregation was insufficient, said King. Rather, he argued for public and private affirmative action. That would mean full employment, economic redistribution. Along with Whitney Young, Martin Luther King Jr. forwarded the idea of a $50 billion Marshall Plan for blacks that would raise up blacks in their socioeconomic status in society. Here's a quote from Whitney Young. Quote, "I hope that we will be able to create the kind of society wherein people will have to apologize for sameness, for an all-white school or neighborhood or church, because this would be an indication of their immaturity, their lack of sophistication," end quote. This led to a schism between, we call the black bourgeois, and the King faction within the National Baptist Convention. At the 1960 meeting, the King faction decided to engage in a sit-in to protest the continuing presidency of Joseph H. Jackson. The next year in Kansas City, the King faction, which was called the Progressive faction, decided to engage in a storm-in, a march-in, and this is where they charged into the congregation and they swarmed the stage. Poor Reverend Wright was startled, tripped off the stage, broke his neck, and died. This led to a faction between the National Baptist Convention and the new Progressive Baptist Convention, which included the King faction. Joseph H. Jackson had the support of most of those in the National Baptist Convention. He opposed the Progressive Baptist Convention because, he said, the end of the church should not be the pursuing of the nonviolent actions that King was engaged in. Joseph H. Jackson argued that nonviolence was actually violence. For example, he looked to the instigation in southern cities where the violent response of the police would bring out cameras. He very much opposed Martin Luther King Jr.'s encouraging of school children to leave school to participate in these marches. He looked at what happened at the nonviolent protests and he said, it's actually violent. He wasn't alone in this. Lewis Killian, the sociologist, pointed this out in a 1968 book, The Impossible Revolution. There he noted that supposedly nonviolent protests often led to students or to young people moving into stores, sitting in the aisles, knocking food or groceries off the counter and intimidating the boss and employees until they got what they wanted. This nonviolent, militant action undermined respect for the law and the democratic negotiation by which blacks could rise in American society. When King traveled north in 1966 so that he could lead marches in the city of Chicago, Joseph H. Jackson helped to squash those rallies. There was a Soldier Field rally that was supposed to draw 100,000. Jackson worked with other blacks in Chicago and Richard Daley to try to reduce that, and successfully, to 20,000. The third position, the response to liberal civil rights, was black power. Martin Luther King Jr. found himself outflanked to the left by young black leaders in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and young leaders like Stokely Carmichael, who advocated a radical and a violent response to white racism. And there was a contest over who would lead the black underclass in these urban areas. Robert F. Williams in 1962 wrote a book called Negroes with Guns. He had actually secured a charter from the National Rifle Association so that blacks could carry guns and resist any violence or threats or intimidation by whites in Monroe, North Carolina. This would inspire the Black Panthers, those like Huey Newton, who wanted to apply the same tactics in Oakland and Los Angeles. Malcolm X is also known as one of the leaders of black nationalism. He attacked King. He said that King was a white liberal, an Uncle Tom, someone who betrayed his own people by getting blacks to assimilate to white society. Another presence for radicalism was the black sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, who wrote a whole book on the black bourgeois. He argued that the black middle class was neurotic in its desire to assimilate to white liberal society, but he said that the white liberal society was a soulless image to assimilate to. Rather, they were a more inferior version of what human beings ought to behave like. Instead, said Frazier, blacks should turn to African intellectuals, those like Frantz Fanon. He was an Algerian revolutionary who opposed French colonial rule. He argued for liberation from the colonial, systematized oppression that didn't just occur in Algeria, but that was occurring in American ghettos all across the country. Those like Frantz Fanon were the, quote, patron saint of many of the black nationalists like Stokely Carmichael. SNCC, that was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Commission, argued that, quote, the bourgeois Negro is force-fed the white man's propaganda, and, quote, he cannot think for himself. There was an all-out assault on the black middle class as being inauthentic. Frantz Fanon was, according to Carmichael, his, quote, patron saint. Carmichael had gone to the Bronx High School of Science, and there he had experienced what it was like to be the lone black in an intellectual setting with a bunch of white liberals who wanted to collect black friends. And there he knew that he didn't fit in, and he adopted an identity politics in opposition to Martin Luther King and a very aggressive and violent rhetoric. And if you read Carmichael's speeches, you see all of the major tenets of identity politics as we understand them today. Racism is something systemic. Racism is something unconscious. That white liberalism was a form of capitalistic oppression. The solution for it was consciousness raising among blacks, where blacks would understand that they should unite in solidarity against a white imperialist monster. Whites themselves, if they were liberal, were the enemies. However, radical whites could unify in allyship. They could not be black, but they could ally with blacks to pursue and help blacks resist this oppressive tyranny. And so all of the phrases we're familiar with today, becoming consciousness or woke of oppression, the elevation of different racial groups so that they could negotiate on a playing field of as equals, as equal powers, as opposed to a kind of liberal welfare that LBJ and the Great Society initiated to keep blacks mired in dependency. So, given this opposition between the black bourgeois and black nationalism, Martin Luther King Jr. begins to tack to the left. He opposed Lyndon Johnson, whom he had allied with throughout the early 60s. He called Vietnam a racist war. He said that the riots would continue unless the U.S. government listened to his pleas for a Marshall Plan for blacks. According to MLK, quote, a riot is the language of the unheard. So in other words, King's position was, I don't endorse the rioting, the looting, but if you don't listen to my economic advice, they will continue and you have been forewarned. MLK argued for a, quote, direct action in, quote, militant, massive nonviolence. He also included some of the same teachings that you find on the left. The teaching of unconscious racism, the teaching of identity politics to topple the system, and to achieve a universal brotherhood. In other words, we would look to group differences to achieve a society without groups in some distant future. He said most Americans are unconscious racists moved by white supremacy. He gives the example, if there is a white woman who fully supports the civil rights platform in full, and yet doesn't want her daughter to marry a black man, then she is infected with the, quote, disease of racism. He argued for the, quote, reconstruction of the entire society, end quote. King went on to support an international Marshall Plan, where white countries would pay out massive reparations to third world countries for their colonialism. Martin Luther King Jr. then, by the end, by his assassination in 1968, and his reputation and his popularity was flagging all through 1967 and 1968, shared much in common with James Cone's Black Theology of Liberation. James Cone wanted to reinterpret Christianity in terms of systemic racism. It was a new religion of anti-racism, in which Christianity meant the fight against oppression. Blacks were the chosen people of God, and according to Cone, salvation would be achieved in, quote, destruction of whiteness, which is the source of human misery in the world. Whiteness being a system of oppression that whites themselves must ally against. And blacks were plagued by original sin insofar as they rejected their own identity. And so what happens in this move to the left on the part of King is he's able to convince many Americans, he's able to provide a new kind of anti-racist religion to many whites. Black elites then adopted the white elite's ethic of authenticity in a radical chic of race solidarity. This was a secular therapeutic substitute for Christian community that traveled back from north to south. And so elites rejected the middle-class sexual restraint. The argument was made. One of them, Robert Gilman, he writes an essay, a review essay, in the Negro American Literature Forum in 1969 about how blacks don't have the same morals as whites and therefore ought not to be measured by them. Black elites and youth postured as revolutionaries. They wore afros, berets, leather jackets. King himself was a transition to this. It was not just that he had the 40-plus extramarital affairs. If you look at many of the white leaders, JFK, who virtually had a harem of imported high schoolers and other young women that he slept with, coerced into performing sexual acts, that's not what's distinctive about Martin Luther King Jr. Rather, it is his justification of the extramarital affairs and some of the odd relations that he formed that often hurt the civil rights movement. King had argued that this form of sexual revolution would achieve a society without repression. He called sexual affairs a form of, quote, anxiety reduction. Quote, every now and then you'll be unfaithful to those that you should be faithful to. King had multiple orgies with black ministers. In 1964, according to the FBI report, quote, when one of the women protested that she did not approve of unnatural sex acts, the Baptist minister immediately and forcibly raped her. King looked on, laughed, and offered advice, end quote. Before he received the Nobel Peace Prize, quote, King's group was running naked, drunk white prostitutes up and down the halls of the hotel, end quote. And so King participated in a transition in the adoption of this notion of authenticity into two different classes in black society that became evident by the end of the 1970s. William Julius Wilson was a black sociologist. He wrote a book in 1978 called The Declining Significance of Race. His argument is that there were tremendous gains that had been made by blacks, and we'll see some of the institutional changes in a future lecture, but that the cost was high. It was a permanent lower class among blacks. What are some of the gains? Let me read them to you. College attendance had increased from 234,000 in 1963 to 1.1 million in 1977. It was the same as whites by 1980. Unemployment had decreased from 9.8% in 1965 to 3.8% in 1969. Blacks in poverty fell from 55% in 1959 to 34% in 1970. Black income had increased 109% in the 1960s, whereas for whites in the same period, it increased only 69%. The earnings of blacks increased to 48% of whites by 1960, 61% by 1970, and for blacks outside the South with two-parent homes to 88% of white income. However, the cost that was paid was a black underclass mired in dependency. Illegitimacy among African Americans was 21.6% in 1960. By 1985, it was 61.4%. Female-headed families increased from 24.4% to 56.7%. Poor blacks had a 40% dropout rate, committed 40% of all murders, with 40% of their children on public assistance. And so the tremendous gains that had been made in the 1960s came at a tremendous cost, and that is 20 to 30% of all blacks in this mired state of dependency.